There is no more counting down. There is no more anticipation. Penn State football is here. So today we are wrapping up our training camp preview. We broke down the offense on 3 separate days this week, but today we're doing the entire defense all at once. And to help me out with that, because it's a big task, I brought in a salty veteran of the Penn State beat, Greg Pickel of Blue White Illustrated. Greg, welcome to the BWI Daily Edition.
I'm so happy to finally be here. We have a lot to talk about with Brent Pry's defense. So many guys back, but so many transfers and so many questions, but also a lot of talent on paper that we'll have to see how it translates to the field.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So we took a long time on the offense because of how bad it was in 2020. The new offensive coordinator, but because, as you mentioned, Brent Pry's defense is returning a lot of starters, but there is a lot of new things in the mix, and I think position switches are really a big key for this this defense. And I think some of my positive projections for 2021. I'm your host, Thomas Frank Carr of the BWI Daily Edition. Don't forget, subscribe here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss a BWI Daily Edition, because it's here. Like, I think it snuck up on people, but Penn State training camp is here. Media Day is tomorrow. Greg's going to be all over that with everybody else over at the at Penn State. They're having a Beaver Stadium this year again.
That's
right. They're gonna have it outside. Yeah. So we're gonna have coverage of that. But quickly, Greg, what do you have up at Blue White Illustrated right now?
Yeah, so we have a couple of things up. You talk about training camp being here. I have a 5 sort of predictions, questions, storylines, things like that posted over at BWI now. And the newsstand is live. So when you look at the daily headlines, the top stories of the day, Anthony Zettel is retired. I know you know from following the NFL and the 49ers. He has decided that he is ready to move on to a different chapter of his life, which is good. Obviously a very productive career, and he said he didn't feel like he had passion and love for the game anymore, so he's moved on. ESPN called Penn State a better job than Michigan, which I know Nittany Nation will love. And Micah Parsons had his first career fumble recovery in a preseason game Thursday night. We have better or worse up on the wide receivers as well.
Sounds like there's so much to get over at bwi.rivals.com. Anthony Zettel, a great transition to the defensive line as we start our preview here on the defense for training camp. One big area that I think, and we talk about position switches, that should have, I think, a positive impact on the defense. PJ Mustipher returning to a more traditional role of what he's done in the past. A little bit more of that nose tackle body type. It was a big storyline this offseason. He got up to 325-ish pounds. Do you think that change is going to have a positive effect on the defense up front, and can he be that stable force in the middle to allow everybody else to work off of him?
Yeah, I would sure hope so. I mean, I think that's the more natural spot for him. I think he may have been asked to do something last year that wasn't maybe in his wheelhouse, but he was the guy that had to fill that role. So I think now he gets back to playing at the spot in the way that he really is built to play and is meant to play and wants to play. So I see a big year in store for him. I think that when you look at what he's done in the past, obviously he's had a lot of big plays, a lot of splash moments rather. And, you know, with Derrick Tangelo now coming in beside him, I mean, I expect that to be one of Penn State's strengths pretty much right out of the gate at Wisconsin. You know, you look at these two guys, obviously Tangelo comes in from Duke and has plenty of experience and production. Mustipher's the same way. They should play off each other and feed off each other very well. I'd be surprised if that tandem doesn't really pop out to Penn State fans and the college football world really pretty early on.
Yeah, and it doesn't even have to be with stats either, right? Mustipher, what he can bring to the table is that stuff that maybe doesn't make the stat sheet, maybe not make the highlight reel, but if you're shutting down the front side of an offensive run and you're forcing somebody to cut, then you get those speedy edge rushers that can come and they can fill in and they can get those tackles for loss. So a potentially big thing for Mustipher. When he was first recruited, I thought he had a chance to be that guy, like Derrick Tangelo is, the guy that can both pass rush and be a really good run defender. Because I know we've talked a lot about Tangelo as a pass rusher, but when I studied his film from Duke, I thought he was a pretty solid run defender. He was in that Mustipher role for Duke. So now they've got 2 of those guys on the interior. So that might be a huge boon not only for the Penn State defensive ends, like I talked about, but for the linebackers as well. So a really interesting move. And I should clarify one thing when it comes to that nose tackle role. Penn State doesn't run a traditional nose tackle. Both players play from that B gap, but it's more about where you're shaded on the B gap. It's kind of the technical inside football sort of stuff. So a small tweak, but may pay huge dividends for Penn State football in 2021. When it comes to those edge rushers, and we'll focus on just two of them in Arnold Ebiketie and Adisa Isaac. In that pass rushing situation, that's what they're going to be relied upon to do. How do you see that tandem working, and do you see them as co-starters, or do you think one of them is eventually going to be in the situation where he is the lead pass rusher?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think obviously when you get into this defensive end rotation, it's interesting because, look, we've all heard the rumors that are out there. We know that people think that Adisa Isaac is banged up and has some kind of an injury. And look, I mean, we're recording this on August 6th, and we don't know what James Franklin will say August 7th, but I did want to note the date because I know some people might save these up and listen to them on a drive or something like that. So I did want to note that really quickly. But when you look at this defensive line as a whole, whether they have Isaac or not, I mean, you have, like we just talked about, Mustipher and Tangelo, two guys who I think will allow the defensive ends, whoever's out there, to really eat up tackles for loss and eat up sacks. And, you know, Penn State fans were really frustrated last year because their sacks weren't always there and the tackles for loss weren't always there. And I think that's going to change in a big way this year. You know, we talk about the better or worse series, and when we looked at the defensive line, my thought process was twofold. Number one, John Scott Jr. has a chance to work with these guys hands-on this year. That's going to make a huge difference, I think, with how they operate. You bring in an all AAC end in Arnold Ebiketie. I realize that he's, I realize he is moving up to the Big Ten, but I really think he's going to be talented. You know, Hakeem Beeman's a guy who we saw at defensive tackle. Does he play more end? We'll have to wait and see. But I don't know, to answer your question, I don't know if Penn State's going to have one guy by the end of the year where we look at him and say, wow, that is the guy. That is the sacks man. That is the speed rusher. That is the guy off the edge you have to fear. I think that collectively it's going to be a very good group, but I'm not sure if there's going to be one guy who just blows everyone else out of the water. I think it'll be a true team effort in that department, and I know that's cliche, and I know that that's not exactly going out on a long limb, but it's hard to sit here today, I think, and feel great about the production part of it because most of these guys haven't yet. So I think that will be a strength for Penn State this year, but to sit here and think that there's a star right now, a Jason Alway or something like that, I just don't, or a Shaka Tony, it's hard to see right now. I think it's more of a team effort in the sacks department and the tackles for loss department as opposed to one guy still stealing the show.
And truthfully, that's how it's been for Penn State, even when they have had a lead dog like Yetur Gross-Matos. Like they've always run in waves. They've always had multiple guys that have been a part of the pass rush. Even then, Yetur would condense into basically the three technique. He would rush over a guard, and he'd get those one-on-ones against a guard, and they would bring more edge rushers on. That's how you get introduced to guys like Adisa Isaac or Odafe Owe over time, is they come in on those third down situations. So one thing we're going to do here as we're previewing the Penn State defense, I'll give you a couple interesting PFF stats that I think translate directly to the situation on the field. So again, if you want to check out any of that stuff, pff.com. Really interesting resource for college football fans, one that I'm a fan of personally. But when it comes to those pass rushing situations, those third downs, that's where in 2020, Penn State really lacked somebody that could win consistently. There's this metric called true pass sets, which is basically that 3rd and 7, you've got to throw the ball. Everyone in the stadium knows it. Can you get to the quarterback? And last year, Penn State could not. An interesting thing about Adisa Isaac is he's flashed, and he's been a good pass rusher, but typically you want to win a quarter of those rushes or more. A quarter is kind of the threshold. 25% is where you want to be. Anything above that, and you're becoming an exceptional edge rusher. He's never won more than 21% of those snaps. Arnold Ebiketie, on the other hand, last year, he would have been, I believe, 3rd in the Big Ten. When it comes to the percentage of pass rushes won, he won 32.5%. So he's well above that 25% threshold. So he might be able to give you some of that speed and efficiency to the quarterback in those third down situations, which, as we'll get to in a little bit, will help the secondary and how they can cover at, down the field in third and long situations. Is there a guy, and I know you said that right now you can't really sit here and say that there's someone you can pin your hopes on. Is there a guy you're looking at as maybe a dark horse to be a productive player that is not a name we're talking about, or a guy that we haven't talked about yet so far today on the show?
Yeah, I'm really interested, and maybe it's not fair to call this guy a dark horse, but assuming he's healthy, which I have no reason to think he's not, at defensive tackle, I'm really interested to see what kind of year Fred Hansard could have. If he's healthy, if he's ready to go, I feel like he can fill a role that Penn State fans hoped he could fill when he was a four-star recruit that just hasn't really happened on the field yet for a variety of reasons, health being the primary one. So he's a guy to watch. And then I mentioned him earlier, but we have heard so many good things about Hakeem Beamon and what he is capable of. And I would be surprised if he doesn't, I don't think he's going to start, obviously, but he should be the second guy off the bench in that rotation. And Penn State fans, if they don't know his name now, absolutely will by the middle part of the season, if not sooner.
He was a bright spot at the end of 2020. If you want any reference point, go back and check out that Michigan game. He was a highly productive penetrator and a guy that was active during that game. And that's really what they're looking for going forward, is that position along the defensive line for him to shine in. But, there's a lot of names, right? So there's a lot of young talent at this defensive line position. I was joking with Dave on the show last week, Dave Eckert, our writer here at Blue White Illustrated, is like, how long can the Penn State offense be young? They've been young for like 4 straight years, and I feel it's relatively the same way about the defensive tackle position, is they just keep being young, and part of that is transfers, but part of it is like that some of these guys do have to step up. Hakeem Beamon is a big name there as well, and Fred Hansard is one of the veterans that you can point to and say might have a role in that defensive line rotation. One place that I think, despite 2020, kind of heads into 2021 with a solid ground underneath it, I think a relatively clear picture is the linebacker core. Now, It needs to improve from 2020, but I do think you can see that happening, again, with some position switches. Brandon Smith moving from the Sam position to the Will position. What's your read on the linebacker position, and how do you feel that will help or hurt with the 3 guys they have there in Brandon Smith, Alex Brooks, and Curtis Jacobs as the projected starters at that linebacking core? How do you think that's going to shake out this year?
Yeah, no question. I mean, you look at the talent. I mean, and on paper, you have 2 former highly regarded linebacker recruits who were considered top of their class or darn near it, in Curtis Jacobs and Brandon Smith. And to me, the position group goes as those 2 guys go. I mean, Obviously, you're going to have Ellis Brooks in the middle. Jesse Luketa, we're going to talk about him in a sec. Is he an end? Is he a linebacker? What are they doing with him? Just to steal your words, you have it listed here that every time someone talks about it, it seems murkier, and that's my exact read on it as well. I mean, I don't know what their usage plan is for him. We'll have to wait and see. But I like Brandon Smith to be a guy who just explodes this season. When we talked to Matt Millen at Big Ten Media Days, that was the first guy he said when we asked him, who are you watching? Who are the guys that kind of stand out to you? And he said, Brandon Smith's going to be a star. So I'm keeping a close eye on him and Curtis Jacobs. Obviously, Ellis Brooks grows into another season at middle linebacker, but I'm assuming Penn State's going to play a lot of 4-2-5 this year. We'll have to wait and see, but that secondary is so talented, it would be hard to believe that they're not going to try and get as many of those guys on the field as possible at all times. So I like the outlook for the linebackers. Obviously, you worry about the depth. So Lance Dixon, obviously not around. Charlie Katcher has received some praise, but hasn't really played a ton, mostly because of injuries. I mean, they're not super deep here. Does Kobe King, the freshman, factor in somehow, at least as a depth piece? We'll see. But that's kind of my concern at this point. Starters look great. The depth is just not there.
Yeah, and you mentioned the secondary, and you mentioned having multiple guys in the slot from the secondary. I want to run down something for you that I found fascinating when I was looking at the information. Brandon Smith, and this is why everyone thinks he's going to have a better year in 2021 than he did last year, and it's about his skill set and alignment. So in 2020, the only player that had more snaps in the slot than Brandon Smith was Lamont Wade, who, by the way, was a slot corner safety hybrid. So he's a guy who's designed to play in the slot. 215 snaps in the slot for Brandon Smith last year, and now he's moving over to that will position where he's going to be in the box more. So just between Jesse Luketa and Lance Dixon, who kind of split time at that will linebacker position, Do you have a guess of how many snaps they spent in space where they were lined up over a receiver that was split out from the offense? Do you have a guess?
I have no guess, but something tells me you do.
It's less than 100, so less than half of the number of times, 87 between the two of them. So he's going to be in a position to make those big impact plays, which he was better at the end of the last season when he moved over there, making tackles, hitting players. He's still going to be lined up in the slot. That's, I think, what you have to understand. Unless you play that Mike linebacker and you're the guy in the middle of the defense, at some point you will be asked to cover in space, but not all the time. And that's really with Brandon Smith what I think it's going to be, is selectively using that length to get in passing lanes. But his ability as the 6'3", he looks like he's 6'6", but 6'3", 240-pound linebacker to run and hit, I think that's more to his skill sets, and I think what Penn State fans were hoping for to be applied to that position last year. Curtis Jacobs, to me, is the dark horse as far as what's the upside. What did you see from him at the end of last year and then spring ball? What was your impression of Curtis Jacobs so far?
Yeah, I mean, again, when you look at him, the potential was always there. I mean, this is a guy who just he looks like the prototypical linebacker, especially for the way the game is played today. So I always thought that I had high hopes for him, I guess is the best way to put it. And, I think with Micah Parsons opting out, we saw more than him than we probably expected to, right? So
yeah,
he was asked to do a little bit more than he probably would have otherwise. And he made 9 tackles. I think he had a pass breakup. He played in 8 games. He grew he grew last year. There's no question. I mean,
yeah.
I think will be better because of that experience. Did it hurt sometimes? Was he put into some positions that maybe a first year linebacker would you'd prefer not to put that player in? Yeah, of course. But I think it'll only help now that he has those experiences. He has those learnings, and it should help Penn State's defense because he's not seeing a lot of things for the first time, and he's going to know how to diagnose things that he saw last year and didn't know how to diagnose either before the snap or after it. So I think all was good on that front. You could see him getting better, and that's all you can ask for.
Yeah, and it really did hurt the young linebackers last year that Micah Parsons wasn't involved. I think to a large degree, too, Lance Dixon was kind of the victim of playing too soon and playing out of position where you kind of had to, what do we do? Do we move 2 players, or do we just insert Lance Dixon into that will position? I always thought he was more of a natural space player like Curtis Jacobs, but then when Jacobs comes in and plays so well, and he's clearly going to be the starter this year, I think you could see the writing on the wall for Lance Dixon that there really wasn't a spot for him anymore. So those reasons why people transfer, it's not just because X, Y, or Z. It might just because the situation dictated, he was a high 4-star player. He wanted to go someplace and find a place to play. So that kind of, I think, informed that, which informs the depth. Of the 3 guys that we mentioned, and I want to throw in Tyler Elsdon as well because I thought he was pretty impressive in the limited snaps I saw in this spring, who would you handicap as the guy that is the 4th linebacker for Penn State?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, again, I if I knew where Jesse Luketa was going to play, it would certainly help this equation. But I mean, I guess I'll go with him out of
Dude,
the
I
gate,
totally ignored Jesse Luketa. I didn't even put him in that conversation.
It's hard, right? I mean, to me, you want to assume that the comment made by James Franklin at the end of spring practice about him playing a different position is going to be not foresight, right? And he is going to play defensive end, but maybe he won't. And if he doesn't, then he is going to be that 4th linebacker. I don't think there's any doubt about it. But if he does have to bump up to the defensive line, or if they think he should bump up to the defensive line, I mean, I guess my thought is this. Charlie Katcher looked fine in those 2 open practices, but again, he's had all kinds of trouble staying healthy. Yeah. So it's tough for me to sit here and say on August 6th that I see a big role for him this fall. If I'm wrong, so be it. But like I mentioned him a little bit ago, I'm just really interested by Kobe King. His brother Kalen obviously was the darling, the star of a shining star of spring practice. But I think Kobe King did some nice things too and received some praise from both teammates and coaches. So I would keep an eye on him and that 4th linebacker spot if Luketa bumps up. I do think they can find a role for him this fall. Maybe starting on special teams and then growing into more snaps on defense.
Yeah, big kid already, college-sized, and I think a really smooth guy who can move well in space. Might not have the top-end speed of some of the other freaks that Penn State has recruited or is recruiting, but I think a really good linebacker, really good at the position. But to the point about Luketa, and this is the last thing I'll say, is he was listed this spring in the 240s. All of a sudden, in the summer, it's like 251, 252. And I'm like you, I'm struggling to find what's his role going to be on the Penn State defense, because if you have, so he's a good run defender. Like, he is a good between the tackles thumper that can go downhill. But Ellis Brooks is your starting middle linebacker. Right. So if he's an early down run defender, are you taking Ellis Brooks off the field as your starting Mike linebacker? No, you're not doing that. So are you bringing in Jesse Luketa on obvious running situations as your will linebacker? That can get dicey, but okay, so that's a super limited role. And then if he's a hybrid player, it's really going to be a niche role for him, and I don't see linebacker snaps readily available, because if you move Ellis Brooks over to the will linebacker position, then you're taking your best player off the field. So really, it's a puzzle piece that I don't know where it fits. It's a corner piece that's got an edge that's wrong. So I don't know what to do with it. But we'll see. That's what training camp is for. That's what the early part of the season is for, is to kind of get the idea of what these things are. Moving on to the secondary, as you mentioned, possibly the most talented part of this team, one that James Franklin has said he hasn't had this much talent in the secondary in quite some time. I guess this is the best question, is what's your biggest question about the secondary so far, seeing as they have 4, maybe 5 deep at talented corners that can play? And we'll talk about the corners specifically here. What's your biggest question about that group?
Can it force more turnovers? I mean, it's great to have tons of talent, and it's great to be deep, and it's great to have the kind of playmaking ability that Penn State appears to have. But if it doesn't equate to more pass breakups, if it doesn't equate to more turnovers, then all you have is a bunch of stars on paper who are not necessarily playing like stars on the field. So when you look at the cornerback room, obviously bringing in Johnny Dixon from South Carolina is a guy who has SEC experience, college football experience. He's going to have a role in Terry Smith's rotation as far as it a starter, is it not? I would assume that your starters are Castro Fields and Joey Porter Jr., but the fact that Kalen King as well was able to basically move 2 players, Keaton Ellis, the safety, and Marquise Wilson, the receiver. I mean, I think that tells you all you need to know about. It wasn't just what we saw in 2 open practices. It was the collective body of work that really stood out to Penn State's coaching staff. So they're deep. I mean, there's no question. This is one of the deeper group of corners Penn State's had, which is good, because last year they were down to what, like 2.5, 3? I mean, they were running. I mean, and so, who gets left out of the mix? Who doesn't see as many snaps? I mean, Daquan Hardy's probably a guy who is going to have to work to find his chances to get on the field. And then you have A.J. Litton, the transfer from Florida State. I'll be curious to see how quickly they can find a role for him. He got here a little bit late and obviously didn't go through spring practice, didn't play last year. I know he's a former 5-star recruit. I know he's super talented, but I'm holding the horses a little bit in terms of how quickly he could make an impact this season.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was struggling to find a role for him again. How he was used at Florida State does not mean that's how he's used at Penn State, but a guy, as you said, a highly regarded recruit. But you've got your clear top 2, Tariq Castro-Fields, Joey Porter Jr. You've got Johnny Dixon, who's been here, and by the way, was a high 4-star recruit. So it's not like so is he a slot guy? 5'11", 186, really good feet. He's a cover corner. I don't think he's that physical sort of slot guy that you want mixing it up in the run game. He's very much a sort of finesse cover guy. But how does that part shake out? And he left Florida State for an opportunity, and he came to Penn State where there's so many players. That's going to be very interesting to see how that shakes out. But you mentioned one thing that I want to get to, because I think it's right on the head when you talk about ball production in the secondary, because Tariq Castro-Fields has been very good as a corner at Penn State. Obviously, he was injured last season, but here are the stats for his career. 2 career touchdowns given up in almost 1,000 coverage snaps. That's phenomenal, according to PFF. The problem is he's got 11 pass breakups in his career. That's not a lot. He's only got 2 interceptions as well. So Penn State, another area that they took a huge step back in 2020 was, if you look at the Big Ten, Greg, and you look at all the players that, their metrics in pass breakups and ball productivity, Penn State didn't have anybody in the top 15 when it comes to guys who got their hands on the ball. Joey Porter Jr. gave up 4 touchdowns last season, which was, again, tied for the second most in the Big Ten. By the way, Sean Wade gave up 7. So just goes to show you that you may have all the headlines, but it might not match up to the play. But Joey Porter Jr. certainly has a lot of headlines coming in, but areas that they need to improve. He was obviously a first-year starter last year, so you're going to have some bumps and bruises as a redshirt freshman. But going forward, ball production, you're absolutely right, is a key for that. And I'm interested to see if that competition, if that depth does produce that. When it comes to that slot position, Daquan Hardy is the guy that so far has been the guy who got the most snaps last year. He's been talked about as that guy. Do you see a competition at that position for those slot snaps?
It's a good question. I mean, I think once we see a couple of practices, it will help us determine whether or not that's going to be the case, because I'll be interested to see, again, Terry Smith, the beauty of what he has there is he can move some guys around and he can mix and match some guys and he can try different things. He did it during spring practice. He's going to do it again during summer camp. And so my gut says there will be a competition, but we have to see a couple of practices, I feel like, to know who exactly is going to be in that mix, in that role, who might thrive in it, who might try it and not be so good at it. I mean, I think those are the questions that are going to have to be answered first. But I would say that, yes, I could see that.
Yeah, and like we just talked about, there's a bunch of guys that I think could do that job, from Litton to Dixon to Hardy. That's going to be a fun place to look at and see if they do have something that can elevate that position, which has been, I think, traditionally a pretty solid position for Penn State. Lamont Wade was up and down, but did have his moments as a slot defender. If you want more on Penn State football, as we are here at the threshold of training camp, it is here, and also here the 2021 Penn State football preview issue, 166 pages, full color. The comprehensive guide to the Nittany Lions' upcoming season, packed with exclusive content from Greg Pickel and others, including interviews, features, opinions, and analysis. Greg didn't write all 166 pages, although I'm not doubting that you could, Greg. But it was obviously a team effort.
Learn a call back, yes.
Learn more at BlueWhiteOnline.com or by calling 800-421-7751. That's 800-421-7751. So let's move on to the last position where Penn State has arguably its headline player in Jaquan Brisker. Yep. We'll talk about the safeties. I'll get to some interesting stats about Brisker and why he is so highly regarded by not just Penn State or the Big Ten, but the nation in general in a minute. Right. But that other position next to him, that field safety, that free safety position, Keaton Ellis moves over there. What is your read on that competition? Because that might be the most open position so far that we've talked about on defense.
Yeah, so, I mean, you look at the safety group, obviously Jaquan Brisker, is receiving All-American talk. Obviously, everyone's really excited about what he can do in his second season back from Lackawanna. But the other spot's a bit of a mystery. So, Lamont Wade, who we talked about a minute ago, obviously moves on. And who starts at the other spot? I mean, is it Keaton Ellis, who moved over to safety after spending a couple of seasons at corner? Is it Jair Brown, the other Lackawanna Falcon, who also plays safety for Penn State? Is it Enzo Jennings, a former highly regarded recruit, just like Tyler Rudolph, who has yet to find his way onto the field? Is it Jonathan Sutherland, the special teams ace, who has seen some time at safety, obviously, as well, during his time on campus? So lots of options, not a lot of production, not a lot of answers. So I would say that coming out of spring practice, I thought Jair Brown was the leader in the clubhouse for that spot. Where are they at now? Yeah, that's a good question. Again, that's another one we'll have to see a few practices to really get a feel for. I would sit here and tell you that I feel pretty good about it being either Brown or Keaton Ellis, but who knows? Maybe Enzo Jennings took a big offseason step. Maybe Tyler Rudolph did the same, or Jonathan Sutherland. We'll have, time will tell. But right now, I just think that based on what we saw during the 2 open practices, which again, we've talked about this a lot, but that was 2 of 15. So We didn't see everything that happened this spring. I think it's either Brown or Ellis.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There wasn't a lot of impact that we got to see from some of those young guys. So until we see a little bit more from Jennings and Rudolph, who I think do have, as you said, they're highly recruited players. I think they have great upside, and for Penn State to hit the high end of their abilities as a secondary, they need one of those young talented players to play some role on the defense. But I think you're right when it comes to either Ellis or Jair Brown, because to me, Jonathan Sutherland has always profiled more as that Jaquan Brisker type, the guy that's going to play over top of the box. He's going to be an enforcer there. I've never been super impressed by him in coverage, and his snaps by alignment also indicate that that's kind of where he is, and I think that that's just a tough break for him, that he's been here for 4 years now. I don't see a path to him, kind of like Jesse Luketa. I don't see a path to him seeing a starting role because of that.
Right.
And Jair Brown is, I think, the front runner for good reason. But that position, when it comes to the productivity, is going to have to take a step forward. But let's get to Jaquan Brisker, because some of the stuff that he did last year was truly special when it comes to his ability as a big 6'1", 205-pound safety. Again, these are according to PFF. He was the best tackling safety in college last year. The lowest percentage of missed tackles, under 2%. So if you're missing tackles at about 8 to 10%, that's roughly average. He was almost like in the .0 digits. Like, he was phenomenal last year. Also the highest graded run defender as a safety. So he was a really strong presence in the box and made more plays on the ball. 6 pass breakups last season, which was up from the year before. Do you think that Anthony Poindexter can help him take that next step, make more plays on the ball, be that true elite all-around safety to lead that secondary as the alpha in that group?
Yeah, I sure hope so. I mean, look, Anthony Poindexter brings a wealth of not just tremendous playing experience, but coaching experience to Penn State as safeties room. So, obviously losing Tim Banks is something that Penn State didn't want to do. He was a great recruiter, great coach, but I think you do have the chance to make an upgrade with Anthony Poindexter coming in. When Bree Castro Fields was talking about Poindexter at Big Ten Media Days in Indianapolis, he really drove home the point that this guy just has a different vibe about him. He is a fun, loving guy, but he will get after it too. I mean, he is a high-intensity coach, and I think Penn State safeties room could use that. So will it improve Brisker's play? Absolutely. Will it improve the room's play as a whole? I don't think there's any doubt about it. So I will be disappointed if this group doesn't take a step forward, because it has all the makings of one that can be very talented, and now it has a coach who knows how to go and play at the next level and needs to take his guys there.
Greg Pickel, Blue White Illustrated, joining me today on the BWI Daily Edition, where we are previewing training camp and we're doing the defense all in one go. So I'm going to take this. This is the last question for me, Greg. I'm going to take your lead on this. Penn State defense, better or worse?
Yeah, so I think the scary part of it to me is that the depth at a lot of spots just isn't there. And there's guys who we look at on the field and say, yep, Brandon Smith, Curtis Jacobs, really highly guarded recruits, should, with Ellis Brooks, have a great linebacker group. Up front, is Adisa Isaac healthy? We don't know. Again, the rumors are out there. We don't know, but we can't ignore them, but we can't confirm them. So I just want to be clear on that. But what does Arnold Ebiketie bring moving up from Temple to Penn State? Is it the same production, or is it about a little bit less, or is it more? We don't know. Inside, I mean, PJ Mustipher, Derrick Tangelo look like they should feed off each other. What if they don't have the kind of tandem success that we expect them to? Where do you go to in the rotation? I mean, there's just not a lot of answers. So outside of corner, which you have to feel just fantastic about, and one safety spot, you have a lot of places on this defense where you believe guys are going to step up and fulfill their potential or exceed it and really play well and really play at a high level, but you just don't know.
Yeah.
And Penn State's defense last year, in a lot of ways, I had challenges, no question. It wasn't just because of Micah Parsons. So I'm going to go with better, and I do it tepidly because of all the questions to answer. But when you bring in a guy like Anthony Poindexter, when you have the kind of talent at corner that Penn State has, I mean, obviously there's different ways to evaluate better. There's the PFF metrics, which are obviously a much more comprehensive look at it. There's also the way fans look at it, a lot of fans anyway, which is, did Penn State win, and did the defense make big plays at the moments when they had to, whether it's a sack, whether it's a tackle for loss, a fourth down stop, an interception in the red zone? I mean, on paper, they have the guys to do those things. And they didn't do it all the time last year, obviously. So I'm going to go with better for that reason. I think that the paper will translate to the field. But if injuries pop up, there's not a whole lot of options to go to, at least not proven ones. And just in general, there's not proven ones. So that's why it's a little bit of a tepid answer for me. But looking at last year, it was such a mess. It seems challenging to me to think that it could be worse than it was a year ago.
Right.
Even with all those questions to answer.
If I could, you're talking about translating things from paper. If I were to transcribe your better, it would be ... better ?
That's right. Yes.
It's about how it sounds. So no, I think that's a fair way to look at it. That is what's going to do it for today here on the BWI Daily Edition. Greg Pickel joining me. We're previewing training camp. Media Day is tomorrow, so make sure you follow Greg. You can see his Twitter handle there at the bottom of the screen. Follow Blue White Illustrated on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast because you don't want to miss anything. Penn State football back at Beaver Stadium with training camp. I'm Thomas Frank Carr for the BWI Daily Edition. We'll talk to you tomorrow.